All right, before I get into this, just a quick note. I'm going to be doing more of these tutorial videos on how I do these 3D landscapes with real world data. So if you have a question about the process, something specifically that you want to know, just drop me a comment and ask me and I'll do a full video on it. And if you've got any feedback on kind of how to make these videos better, more detail, less detail in the future, let me know as well. So without further ado, here's how Cathedral in Arizona is made. All right, good morning. My goal today is to walk through how I made this piece that's sort of sitting in front of us right now. This is called Cathedral. It is a 3D render made in Blender that's a replica, essentially, of a location in Sedona, Arizona. And my process as an artist is somewhat unique. I use real world data. So data that comes from satellites, from airplanes, from photogrammetry, from all sorts of tools, to fully recreate a location on Earth in 3D software like Blender or Unreal Engine. And the process to do this is pretty intensive. I'm just going to walk through the whole thing kind of end to end today. It's a bit of an experiment, and hopefully with any luck, I'll be able to sort of show the process in a way that is kind of understandable to someone who's getting into 3D or is maybe interested in doing this process themselves. So let's get into it. The first thing that I do when I'm looking at recreating a location is I do some scale. So these are all the locations of previous works that I've done, and this one in particular called Cathedral, outing on Google Earth. So these are all the locations of previous works that I've done, and this one in particular called Cathedral. You see it right here. We're going to do a fly to Cathedral. So, this might come from inspiration. Maybe I saw a photo on Instagram or I was traveling and I noticed this location. This particular spot is something I had seen on some photography websites before. And when I was in Sedona, I went to scout it out to see if it would be a cool location. So you can see here, it looks like it's kind of like a lake, sitting or a little pond, and the shot of the mountains in the background. So what this actually is what we're looking at right here, which is a little trailhead in Sedona, Arizona. So you can see this is Cathedral Rock. Is this little location called Slick Rock or Secret Slick Rock Trailhead. So, you park over here, you go down this little trail. It's only maybe 200 meters, and you get to this thing they call Slick Rock, which is sort of an exposed rock face with a beautiful view of the valley, and in particular of Cathedral Rock. So Google Earth is a little bit difficult to navigate, but this is it. Now, if you zoom in right here, you can already kind of see this. This is actually cactus. It's low quality on Google Earth. And there's this little indentation here, and then another one, an indentation here. And this particular one down here, when it rains, this fills with water. So if you're going to Sedona to Arizona to do this as a photographer, or if you want to try my crazy 3D process, it's got to rain. So once it rains, this puddle basically fills up, and if you put your camera down low, you can get this shot. So I went there, traveled to Sedona, went and scouted it out, waited for I think 4 days in the parking lot. So this is me in my van, parked outside of the location in Sedona. And I'm just sitting there watching the mountains, a beautiful view, really cool spot, but waiting for it to rain. So I think on the third or fourth night it rained. And the first thing that I do when I go out is I go out and I take like a ton of reference photos. So here's the actual, this is kind of shows you, this is the actual reference shot that I took that ultimately became the render. So this was this specific location. I looked at, things like the detail in the rock. So I took this like closer shot so I could really understand what was going on here on the terrain side. I went and did time lapses. So this is a cool one to kind of see how the light kind of moves on this scene. There's the puddle. So there's a wide view of the actual shot. So you saw on Google Earth where I was located. So this is that spot, literally right here. And it's a good one of me with my little dog. This is Alpine. So she was there, and I got her to kind of pose for scale. But anyway, I've got all this information about this actual location. So I have, everything that I kind of need in terms of reference. And then in this case, what I did was I did two things. I did LiDAR. There it is. So this is me on my phone. Now this is using like a combination of LiDAR and photogrammetry. So what it's doing is it's taking individual pictures of the ground, and it's also taking LiDAR scan. And what you can see is as it's doing it here, it's recreating the terrain. Yeah, so there's references of the cactus. I use this in the 3D render, which I'll show you in a second. Yeah, I did a full photogrammetry scan of the cactus, which you'll see in the scene. I'll show you that in a second. So I have all that information, and basically I can leave. Everything else can be done remote, so I can head home. I can do it in the van, wherever I am. I can basically start working on the piece. So the next step that I need is I need high resolution terrain data. And what this means is essentially what Google Earth is doing here. So you can see you're looking at this in Google Earth, and if you go up to the satellite view, you can see, okay, here's where we were, here's where we took the photo, here's Cathedral Rock, and you can already kind of see in this satellite view that there's like some depth. There's a bit of 3D to what is in this image, and this is what Google Earth does. So if I kind of scroll down like this, you can see, hey, there's actual terrain here. And this is actually pretty good, and you can do a lot with this. And I've actually experimented with pulling this data into the scene, but it looks great from further away. But when you start getting close, you realize there's not a lot of detail here. There's a lot of shadowing on the images. It looks like it's there, but there's not a lot of detail. And the other issue is that the shadows are baked into the scene. So like that shadow there is from an image. So you can't change the lighting in your scene later. You can't do anything. If you're making a video game and you're exploring this area will always have that shadow. So it is useful to use this kind of Google Earth data, and it's getting very good. But for the type of 3D replication that I need to do, I can use some of this as a source, but I can't just take this data and go from here. So I start by getting actual real data from these scenes. And in this case, one of the easiest ways to do that, if you're looking in the US, it's different in every country, but in the US particular, USGS, US Geological Survey. So this is a map of the United States, and anywhere that there's green, there's LiDAR. Now, LiDAR, it might be like the darker it is, the higher quality, I can't remember, but I kind of assumed I would be able to get the LiDAR data from this. Okay, so there's Phoenix. So if we go to Phoenix here, so you can see there's LiDAR over Phoenix. There's LiDAR up here on the 17. And then if you get in here, all of a sudden you see this gap, and that's Sedona. So this really messed me up. If you're working on a project like this, you're trying to do it, pick a location that has this, data, because if you don't, you have to get into some crazy stuff like I did for this project, which makes it kind of fun, but frustrating. So in this case, I didn't have access to this data. So from other sources, I was able to get a very low resolution terrain map of Sedona, and I needed to merge it with higher quality data. And through a bunch of emails and conversations, I determined that there was data available. It was flown, I think, by the community of Oak Creek, I think it was called, and they did it when there was a flood of this Oak Creek, I think maybe 10 years ago. So when there was a flood, they went out and they did a LiDAR scan. They flew airplanes all around the area. They captured this LiDAR data. They're shooting lasers at the ground to figure out how much damage there was in the flood. And because they had that, I was able to purchase it from that actual area. So this is the data I purchased. You can see there's Cathedral Rock. Unfortunately, it was like, I think, if I remember right, I think this is Slick Rock here. So I kind of was in a weird spot because I had to buy this tile here, which is the Cathedral Rock. And then I think I had to buy this tile, or I may have convinced them to give me a couple for free, but I purchased this one and I got a couple extra to kind of reconstruct this area. So I was able to get that data. And then this is the most complicated part of this. And if you don't have a background here, this is where most people are going to get, kind of frustrated or get confused. I have worked for GIS companies. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to kind of work my way around it. And I had some help on this project by a good friend who was able to kind of take some of this high quality LiDAR data and process it into the height map that I needed. But here's the quick overview, right? So if you look at this location, this area here with the lines is my area of interest. So this is I think probably like a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer area. And you can see it includes Sedona, or a Cathedral rock. It also includes Slick Rock, which is right here. So the idea is that I have the whole thing in this area of interest, but when I compose my image, if you kind of think of my camera being over here and a camera going out this way and out this way, it has, as much of the background as I need and the sides as I need for my image. Then I downloaded, I think this is going to be, yeah, you're not going to be able to see this very well, but on the stream. But if you look closely, you can see that there's kind of these grayish tones here, the lowest quality terrain data you can get. And it's kind of like a canvas for the whole world, very low quality, but I was able to get this, it's free, to kind of create a low resolution landscape. And then I actually had to go and get the high quality stuff, which was processed. And this is what that looks like. So if you zoom in, you can see it here. If I turn off at AOI, now you have something that I can really work with. So what represents here is everything, the lighter or the brighter the white, the higher the elevation of this area. So you can see like super white here, then you can see the drop off to gray, you can see the contours, and this is what the human eye can see. Basically, there's a lot more values in the pixels, so like the brightest to the darkest, than what you can see on your screen. So very high resolution data. I had to blend this data with the outside data, merge it together. It was crazy complicated. I wouldn't recommend anyone try this. I could do a tutorial on it in the future, but it's much better if you get kind of a good quality data set that you can just use, not trying to merge multiple data sets together. Okay, the end result is I get this copy. I have now what this is called a height map. So this is just a regular image, white and black, to show the height. I take that and I bring it into a tool called Gaia. And what you're seeing right now is obviously looks like, pretty kind of cool, like video game isometric view of Cathedral. But what it starts at, okay, so we have the original file, that height map that we had in QGIS. We bring that into Gaia, and now you can kind of see like a bit more detail here. But essentially what this is doing is it's taking the height map and it's converting it to a 3D terrain. And what you can see here, I'm trying to remember my Gaia controls, is you can see like there's kind of cool, like higher resolution data. You can see it in here. But as you get to the outside, it's very simple. There's these little ridges and you can kind of see the general outline, but it's not very good quality. But we don't care, because really what we want, the star of the show, is, this Cathedral rock here. Now, this doesn't look right at first. And what we do with Gaia is we process it through a series of nodes. Now, if you've never used nodes, you're not comfortable with it, this is going to be crazy, but I'll just kind of give a quick run through. I basically normalize the data, so I sort of adjust a curve. You can see this curve up here to kind of bring the lower parts down to what they would really be, bring up the top, sort of just shape it to make it, kind of exactly represent what it was. I do some blurring, so I blur out some of the outline, which gets rid of those like little contour lines. Then I apply some erosion to it. This really starts to bring back detail. So you can see here we kind of have a little bit of like water flow forming. I do another erosion node, and here I'm masking out areas that I don't want to affect, which means basically I don't want to affect this top part of the mountain, because it will sort of quickly erode it into something that doesn't look like it actually looks. But you can see it's adding some nice little detail in here. And then flip over to this one. I think this is just going to be a bit of cleanup. And now I have essentially the terrain that I'm going to use in the actual project. So because now that we have the terrain, we have something that we can essentially use in a tool like Blender or Unreal Engine. In my case, it's Blender. But we need to start generating some additional masks and data that we can use when we start kind of creating our terrain. This is essentially what they call like a color mask in Gaia. And what it does is it takes in, again, the same terrain data we have, and it starts to generate these masks. So these little masks are really useful when you're doing stuff like texturing and coloring in Blender. So if you're doing like color variations between like browns and reds or browns and yellows, you can use this kind of texture mask just to add a bit of detail to the scene. Other ones are just generating the grass. This is just generating a general color for the grass, a general color for the ground. And then we're combining those together using things like a rock mask, which is kind of showing like, here's where the parts of the scene are going to be that are kind of more rocky versus more flat. We combine those together. Now we get some greens in here and the reds. We can get the cliffs, so we get a mask that kind of shows us, and then we can go get the slope. So this is where it's very, very steep slope versus black, which is very shallow. And we can apply those colors together. So now you can see there's a slightly different color on the cliffs. And then we can add in blue, and then we can use another mask that we have, which is for the water, to combine those together. So when it's all said and done, we now have a 3D terrain that not only has, all of the kind of contours and all the detail we need, but we also have some cool stuff like the water. We've got grass versus dirt. We've got cliffs versus, flatter areas. And then we can output a bunch of masks that we can use in Blender. Here's our height map, which is our new version of the one we saw earlier, which is a normal map, which you've worked in 3D. This adds a ton of detail to your scenes, maybe steepness. And then here's another one for sort of the contour lines around the scene. So anyway, you have all this data. You have everything that you need now to start to recreate a proper scene in your 3D software. And there's a couple ways to export that terrain into Blender. You can actually export from Gaia like a 3D model, but the better way to do it is to export a height map. If I open up Blender, these are the terrain files. And the way that this basically becomes what it is with a displacement. So this isn't like a full lesson on how to do this, but just to kind of get an idea. Essentially, it's as simple as you create a plane, and in Blender, there's a tool over here called displacement. And what displacement will do is it'll take an input file. In this case, we take our height map that we have from Gaia, and we would, in this file, we first of all would like subdivide this thing into as many squares as we can, 100, for example, and then add even more geometry with something called a subdivision surface, and then you can go in and you can displace it. So here's like just a kind of a fun example. This is just, I think, a random rock texture that I had, but you can see the idea is that this is now displaced this plane based on an image, which is this image right here. So you can kind of get an idea from this one. This is just a clouds texture, is that you've got kind of dark areas, which are lower height, and white areas, which are higher height. And you can kind of see that basically just replicated that texture on here, but it actually has real geometry. So there's a real height to this actual image. And now if I shade it smooth, we have a terrain. So this is the basis of every, 3D terrain software, anything you're going to do in Blender with terrain. Tons of tutorials on this, but obviously if you have a real height map, as opposed to, a standard rock displacement, you can do something really cool. Yeah. Okay, there we go. This will give you an idea. So you can see that there basically is a little terrain here. Yeah, I mean, it's not perfect because, again, I probably brought in the wrong setup here. But basically, you can see what's happening. It regardless of what exactly the quality it looks like, you can see that it has displaced this image or this plane with that terrain. So that's basically what I did. I kind of broke it into different sections. So this is just for optimization. Again, Blender is just struggles with these big files. I've since kind of moved over to Unreal Engine, and Unreal Engine can handle this. You don't have to do all this craziness, but for what I was doing in Blender, it required some really weird optimization stuff. So in this case, I just recreated the foreground according to what I needed for this particular project. So you can kind of see it here. It's just a real simple like sculpt. It's not actually following the real terrain, but you can see when you bring the camera down, it's sort of a bit of a camera trick in that, the foreground is separate from the background. I don't normally like to do this. I like to really recreate the scene fully. But in this situation, when you're doing something like this is typically how people would do stuff in 3D. It's like you only want to work on the stuff you can see on the camera. Okay, so once you have the terrain, the next step is creating some texture. We can start with the foreground. So it looks like a mess. So you can kind of see this here. It looks very weird from this side, but all of this is actually water. So this is all underwater. Kind of see what's going on. It's sort of a bit of a wave texture that was sort of simulating what I was seeing when I was looking at the reference image. Yeah, this ridiculous node tree. Basically what this is doing is it's separating out the wet areas of the terrain versus the dry areas. So you can kind of see it. It looks messy from here, but you can kind of see along the edges of the water, it gets darker. And that is coming from essentially a mask that I would have painted over top of this around those areas to make the water. You can see now with the water, you have this whole flat area. You can kind of get a feel for this now, whereas we've got this water, the rocks in the background, and then the mountains. The reason why you don't see kind of the same lighting and the colors because I've isolated out only the textures in here. So you can see from a texture preview, now you've got this kind of mud. You can see here where the mud is a little bit wet along the edges. Sort of really rough, but it kind of works. And then the water itself is another texture. So if we go into the water, you can see it here. It's a displacement, which is just the ripples that you would see in a typical pond, which sort of applies another displacement. So it kind of applies a bit of a geometry to the water itself. So you can't see it here. What it's doing is inside the texture, it's kind of faking it. It's making it look in the texture that there is ripples, that there's actual height, right? Because if water has wind and waves, you can kind of see, in reference images, you can see that obviously water will have that kind of ripple effect where it distorts, the view and shows you sort of that, it's not like a flat plane. So that's what basically happened here. If I flip back over, you can see is this plant. Again, we've got a ground plane. So we have this little piece of the ground that I sort of broke out, and it's got a bit of texture detail on it. I've used a plugin, I think it was called Botanic, which is for foliage. So we're just able to scatter on top of the terrain a bunch of little pieces of grass, some dry, some healthy, bigger pieces of grass. And this is all, so this is the original photo, and this is the render. And you can see, obviously the difference. Now, this is before I bring it into Lightroom and Photoshop, and I clean up the contrast and, do a bunch of stuff to it. But you can kind of see the differences between them. But if you look at the plants, it's interesting. So if you take a look at this is where photogrammetry really comes in. So, I obviously placed this stick manually in the scene, and this is the real life version. And this is my fake version. It's not exactly the same, but it looks like it's in the same spot. And you can see the ground with the grass is close, but it's not the same. But if you look at the cactus, it's where it gets really kind of fun, because other than like a few changes of where they are, these were actual photogrammetry scans of the cactus. So you get, not perfect, but you get like kind of a real nice, simple but very realistic view of these cactus from doing the scan. So again, this is the scan, this is the reality, the photo, and it's pretty good. You can see like these are real, 3D files. So there's real depth, like there's actual 3D object here. If you were to put that in a video game or, wander around the scene, you actually could walk to any side of these actual cactuses and actually see them. There's not really much more detail in the scene. It's really the water, the mud, the cactus, the ground, the grass. And then getting up into here, you can see in the background, there's, layering here of the kind of the light and the dark, and you can see the lines in the actual texture. So these little kind of sediment lines that you would see when you go to Sedona. There's grass kind of growing in certain areas along the ridges. And then even there's some grass at the top. So if you take a peek at the piece, that's representative of what was going on here. You see the ridge lines, you see the little bushes and the grass, and you even see some grass at the top of the photo. So I tried to reproduce that as much as I could. I started with that, and then if you go into the shader, you're going to see a very complicated shader network. And I won't go through all this. It's not a full tutorial, but the basic idea is, you have one for the ground, you have another one for the wall, which is this part, and then you have all sorts of masks and other tools to basically blend the shapes together. So we're blending together one for all of the, horizontal strata in the rock, another one that's adding in all these little details and crevices, another one that's like showing the differences between, the ground in certain areas and like the vertical rock face. But basically this whole crazy network down here of nodes. And then the only thing really left to do here is atmosphere in the scene. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. You could put a reference photo in behind the actual landscape. You can create like your own clouds and your own sky procedurally. There's third-party plugins that will do all sorts of cool stuff. But what this is very straightforward. It's just an HDRI, it's called. So it's basically a 360 photo that was captured and licensed and then basically brought into the scene, which not only provides the lighting for the scene, so it adds light where the actual image is. Like it looks at where is it bright in the scene versus where is it dark, and wherever it's bright, it's actually emitting light into the scene. And then we actually add an atmosphere, which is just a big cube. You can see it's like one of the fun Blender tricks. So it looks like it's just a cube of fog in the scene, but this is actually a massive cube. You can see that in the middle of this, crazy fog is the actual terrain. So it's a massive file. And if we bring our camera down, we can see, it goes away. You just sort of see the atmosphere, but it is fully immersed in the scene. And what that's doing is taking the light from this HDRI, it's sort of spreading it around, and it's doing something really useful in Blender called, I always mispronounce this word, but it's called anisotropy. Anisotropy. Basically, it's the way that light reflects off of the particles. So you can kind of see it here. You can see how like it really lights up. It almost creates like a bit of God rays coming in. We then add in an actual sun to amplify it. And in Blender, you can actually match, where the sun is in the scene in relation to the sun in the HDRI. Like this is a really cool effect. That's such a, there you go, right? Such a fun effect with the fog and the light. And, from an artistic standpoint, you could do something like this and, you wouldn't even see the textures. You wouldn't need it. But, to recreate a photo like I did, you kind of can't take those creative shortcuts when you're making this. So those two light sources together with the atmosphere is all you need. And now you have what you see here. If you turn off the atmosphere, you see it gets much brighter, but it also kind of starts to look a little bit more fake. So the atmosphere really adds a lot to the scene. And you see if you turn off the sun, you just get still some atmosphere and some light. Like you can still see the scene, but we don't have as much. And if I was to turn off the lighting on the HDRI, you just get that. So it's sort of merging together to create both. Now it's going to take a second. Some ambient atmosphere, some lighting all around, plus the light from the sun. Like those all together is kind of the common way in Blender that you would light a scene. And it's coming back. And then the last thing that I do with this is I would render it out in the highest quality I can, a flat image profile in a TIFF, or EXR, something that's like lossless, like has highest quality. It's almost like rendering out a raw image if you're a photographer. And then I take that into like a standard photo editing process that I would run on my landscape photography. The end result is essentially this file right here.